afternoon, everybody. This is Carol and Freddie here, and we're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And we are on chapter 12 now. And chapter 12 is called Peter's First Battle. And in this chapter, it's all about courage. And maybe you can think of something that you've done lately or in the past, or one of your friends or family members have done that took a lot of courage. All right, so let's begin Peter's first battle. While the dwarf and the white witch were saying this, miles away, the beaver and the children were walking on hour after hour into what seemed to be a delicious dream. Long ago they had left their coats behind them, and by now they had even stopped saying to one another, "Oh, look, there's a kingfisher," or "I say, bluebells," or "What's that lovely smell?" or just "Listen to the thrush." They walked on in silence, drinking it in, passing through patches of warm sunlight, into cold green thickets, and out again into wide mossy glades where tall elms raised and they had a leafy roof far above their head, and then into the dense mosses of flowering currants and among hawthorn bushes that had the sweet smell, and it was almost overpowering. Do you ever feel that here when the winters have been so long and spring comes? What a wonderful feeling it is. That's what they were feeling. And they had been just as surprised as Edmund when they saw the winter vanish and the whole wood passing in a few hours from January to May. That hadn't even known for certain, as the witch did, that this was what happens when Aslan comes to Narnia. But they all knew that it was her spells which produced the endless winter, and therefore they all knew when this magic spring began that something had gone wrong, and badly wrong for the witch's scheme. And after the thaw had been going on for some time, they also realized that the witch could no longer be able to use her sledge. After that, they didn't hurry so much, and they allowed themselves more rest and longer ones. They were pretty tired by now, of course, but not what I'd call bitterly tired, only slow and feeling very dreamy and quite inside, as one does when one is coming to the end of a long day when they've been out in the open. And poor Susan, she had a slight blister on her heel. They had left the course of the big river some time ago, for one had to turn a little to the right, which meant a little to the south, to reach the place of the stone table. Even if it had not been their way, they couldn't have kept to the river valley once the thaw began, for with all that melting snow, the river was soon to be in flood, a wonderful, roaring, thundering yellow flood, and their path would have been under water. And now the sun got low, and the lighter got redder, and the shadows got longer, and the flowers began to think about closing. "Not long now," said Mr. Beaver, and began leading them up the hill, across some very deep springy moss. Oh, that spring moss felt so nice on their tired feet, in a place where only tall trees grew, and they were very wide apart. The climb, coming at the end of a long day, made them all pant and blow, and just as Lucy was wondering whether she could really get to the top without another long rest, suddenly they were at the top. And that is where they saw. There, on the green open space, from which you could look down on the forest spreading as far as one could see in every direction, except right ahead, there, far to the east, was something twinkling and moving. "By gum," whispered Peter to Susan, "the sea!" In the very middle of this open hilltop was the stone table. It was a great, grim slab of grey stone, supported by 4 upright stones. It looked very old, and it was cut all over with strange lines and figures that might be letters in some unknown language. They gave you a curious feeling when you looked at them. The next thing they saw was a pavilion pitched on the side of one of the places. A wonderful pavilion it was, especially now when the light was sitting on the sun and it fell upon it, with sides of what looked like yellow silk and cords of crimson and 10 pegs of ivory. The high above it was a pole and a banner, which bore a red, rampant lion fluttered in the breeze, which was blowing in their faces from the far-off sea. While they were looking at this, they heard the sound of music on the right, and turning in that direction, they saw what they had come to see. Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves around him in the shape of a half-moon. There were tree women, there were well women, dryads and naiads, as we had called them in our world, who had strung instruments. It was they who had been making the music, and there were 4 great centers. The horse part of them was like a huge English farm horse, and the man part was like a stern but beautiful giant's. There was also a unicorn and a bull with the head of a man, and a pelican and an eagle and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, to whom one carried his crown and the other his standard. Yeah, so maybe you can imagine exactly what he was looking at. Now, I would say that would take courage just to even look at that sight. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to say or do. People who had not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing could not be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they would occur to it to be now, for when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great, royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes, and they found they couldn't look at him, and they started to tremble. "Go on," whispered Mr. Beaver. "No," whispered Peter. "You first." "No. Son of Adam before animals," whispered Mr. Beaver back again. "Susan," whispered Peter. "What about you? Ladies first." "No, you're the eldest," whispered Susan. And of course, the longer they went on doing this, the more awkward they felt. Then at last Peter realized it was up to him. He drew his sword and raised it to salute, and hastily saying to the others, "Come on, pull yourselves together, advance to the lion," and said, "We have come, Aslan." "Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he-beaver and she-beaver." His voice was deep and rich, and somehow took the faggots out of them. They now felt glad and quiet, that it all didn't seem awkward to them to stand and say nothing. "But where is the 4th?" asked Aslan. "He has tried to betray them and joined the White Witch," said Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. And then something made Peter say, "That was partly my fault, Aslan. I was angry with him, and I think that helped him go wrong. And Aslan said nothing either to excuse Peter or to blame him, but merely stood looking at him with his great golden eyes, and it seemed to all of them that this is where there was nothing to be said. "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "can anything be done to save Edmund?" "All shall be done," said Aslan, "but it may be harder than you think." And then he was silent again for some time. Up to that moment, Lucy had been thinking how royal and strong and peaceful his face looked. Now, all of a sudden, it came into her head that he looked sad as well. But the next moment, the expression was quite gone. The lion shook his mane and clapped his paws together. Terrible paws, thought Lucy. If he didn't know how to velvet them, she said. "Meanwhile, let the feast be prepared, ladies. Take these daughters of Eve to the pavilion and minister to them." When the girls had gone, Aslan laid his paw and thought it was velvety, as it ever was so very heavy, on Peter's shoulders, and then he said, "Come, son of Adam, and I will show you far off sight of a castle where you will be king." And Peter, with his sword still drawn in his hand, went with the lion to the eastern edge of the hilltop. There a beautiful sight met their eyes. The sun was setting behind their backs. That meant the whole country below them lay in the evening light. Forests and hills and valleys, winding away like silver snakes, and the lower part of the great river, and beyond all this, miles away, was the sea, and beyond the sea the sky, full of clouds which were just turning rose color in the reflecting of the sunlight. But just where the land of Narnia met the sea, in fact, at the mouth of the great river, there was something in the hill shining. It was shining because it was a castle, of course, and the sunlight reflected from the windows which looked towards Peter in the sunlight as the sun was setting. But to Peter, it looked like a great star resting on the sea. "That, O man," said Aslan, "is Claire Paviel of the 4 thrones, in one of which you must sit as king. I show it to you now because you are the firstborn, and you will be high king over all the rest." And once more Peter said nothing, for at the moment a strange noise broke the silence. It was like a bugle, but much richer. "It is your sister's horn," said Aslan to Peter in a low voice, so low as it did almost a purr, but it was disrespectful to think that a lion was purring. For a moment Peter didn't understand. Then he saw all the other creatures start forward and heard Aslan say, with a wave of his paw, "Back! Let the prince win his spurs." He did understand and set off running as hard as he could to the pavilion, and there he saw a dreadful sight. The nods and the dares were scattered in every direction. Lucy was running towards him as fast as her short legs could carry her. Her face was as white as paper. When she saw Susan make a dash for a tree and swing herself up, followed by a huge gray beast. At first Peter thought it was a bear. Then he saw that it looked like an Alsatian, although it was far too big to be a dog. Then he realized it was a wolf standing on his hind legs, with his front paws against the tree trunk, snapping and snarling. All the hairs on its back stood on its end. Susan had not been able to get any higher than the second big branch. One of her legs hung down so that her foot was only an inch or two from the snapping teeth of the wolf. Peter wondered why she didn't go higher, or at least take a better grip. Then he realized she was about ready to faint, and that as she fainted, she'd fall off. Peter did not feel very brave. Indeed, he felt as if he was going to get sick, but that moment, no difference to what he had to do. He rushed straight up to the monster and aimed a slash of his sword at its side. That stroke never reached the wolf. Quick as lightning, it turned around, its eyes flaming, its mouth wide open in a howl of anger. If it had not been so angry, and it simply had to howl, it would have gotten him by the throat at once. As it was, though, all this happened too quickly for Peter to think at all. He had just time to duck down and plunge his sword as hard as he could between the brute's forelegs and into its heart. Then came a horrible, confused moment, like something in a nightmare. He was tugging and pulling, and the wolf seemed neither alive nor dead, and his bad teeth knocked against his forehead. Everything was blood and heat and hair. A moment later, he found the monster lay dead, and he had drawn his sword out of it and was straightening his back and rubbing the sweat off his face and his eyes. He felt tired all over. I would say that was rather brave, don't you? I don't know if I could do the same thing. Then after a bit, Susan came down the tree. She and Peter felt pretty shaky when they met. I wouldn't say there wasn't kissing and crying on both sides, but in Narnia, no one thinks any worse of you for doing that. Quick, quick, shouted the voice of Aslan. Sentries, eagles, I see another wolf in the thickets, there behind you. He has just darted away. After him, all of you. He will be going to his mistress. Now is your chance to find the witch and rescue the fourth son of Adam. And in an instant, with the thunder of the hoofs and the beating of the wings, a dozen or so of the swiftest creatures disappeared in the gathering of the darkness. Peter, still out of breath, turned and saw Aslan close at hand. You have forgotten to clean your sword, said Aslan. It was true. Peter blushed. When he looked at the bright blade and saw it smeared with the wolf's hair and blood, he stood down and wiped it quite clean, and in the grass, then wiped it quite dry on his coat. Hand it to me and kneel, son of Adam. And when Peter had done so, he struck him with the flat end of the blade and said, Rise up, Sir Peter Friends Blonde, and whatever happens, never forget to wipe your sword. That is the end of chapter 12. I hope none of us ever run into that adventure. But maybe one day we'll go to Narnia too. Well, thank you for joining us, and I will see you next week. Thank you, and good night. And did you want to say good night to Freddie? You know, there he is, Mr. Fred. And let's see, yes, Leroy and Abby. And they have been keeping me very good company. I can't believe we've been reading this book for months now. Time has been going by fast, and we hope it continues to come to an end, just as the book does. Thank you.